Well, I mean, I think they're relevant in a couple of ways. One, much of the research on learning, particularly in urban contexts, sort of point to, the fact that particularly urban youth need to have a learning experience that's engaged in the kind of conditions that they face in their communities. So the extent to which curriculum and after-school learning activities are placed in the context of urban communities, that is, the kind of issues that they deal with in urban communities, it makes the learning environment much more richer. So when young people, for example, if you think about the Algebra Project, where young people are learning about algebra by looking at bus routes and understanding velocity by looking at how the buses move and so forth. It sort of connects this sort of abstract way of learning in the classroom with some of the everyday realities they sort of navigate in their own communities. And I think there's a number of examples, particularly for urban youth of color. One of the ways in which I think these principles can be made more meaningful is trying to understand the ethnic and cultural realities of these young people. So I think it's important that these learning opportunities be in context and that they have sort of meaningful engagement. But if you sort of unpack some of the principles, that also means that for urban youth of color, that their own identities, around their own racial identities, their own ethnic identities, are also important in their own development, in their own meaning they sort of receive from instruction and after-school programs. So many of the programs that I find effective with urban youth of color particularly pay attention to the ways in which race and ethnicity are integrated into after-school programming and activities. I think it's important to be clear about which kids, right? So when you use the term kids, I think that from my own research, and I think research on youth development in general, clearly sort of concludes that there's no sort of homogeneous category of young people, right? So urban youth, gay, lesbian youth, African American youth, Latino youth, suburban youth, rural youth, all of these young people have different experience in different contexts. So the extent to which after-school learning and in-school learning are really paying attention to the broader social context and the sort of identities young people bring to these learning moments, then I think that also that has, like I said before, that really enriches the learning opportunity and the learning experience. So I think the question was about the shift to learning. I think my own reactions is that that learning happens across a number of contexts. So it's not just sort of in-class learning. So young people learn, for example, in my own work around when they engage in youth organizing, when they're addressing issues of injustice in their communities, that's a profoundly rich learning opportunity. And so I think when sort of unpacking the category, the definition, and sort of broadening the notion of learning, I think is important in trying to understand how that process is carried out. So one way, as an example of active, is young people who are involved with youth organizing. These issues are important to them. The issues around police in their schools, the issues around school funding, the issues around equity. These are issues that young people face and are engaged in that I think is a great example of active engagement. In terms of collaborative work, I think that, when young people are engaged in active sort of learning, particularly with youth organizing, it is a community building event. So that the organizing in itself cannot happen as an individual by its very nature. It's a community engaging event, meaning that young people learn how to work collaboratively, learn how to negotiate, learn how to navigate power and so forth. And so it's, by its very nature, the youth organizing process in schools or out of school allows for young people to build community and learn collaboratively. So that's just a couple. I think the concept of sort of meaningful participation is one that I've already talked about, which is this matters to me, right? That when young people are organizing around, for just most recently here in Oakland, there was a campaign to redo the policies about how security guards are hired and fired and the kind of work that they do in schools, right? They won the Black Organizing Project sort of won this campaign. Well, those issues matter most to young people who experience schools. And so this notion of meaningfulness, I think, is really important. And so I think the principles that are laid out can be applied to urban youth, can be applied to youth of color, can be applied to a number of contexts. Any activities that foster creativity, foster innovation, foster critical thinking, that allow for young people to use their imagination. I think that those kinds of activities are profoundly important, and oftentimes you don't find that enough in sort of conventional public school classroom settings. You find those in private schools, and you find those in elite, private schools and so forth, and after-school programs, but you don't necessarily find enough of that in the public school settings. And so I think it's really critical to find educators who understand how to navigate that. So some of my own students who are teachers who are sort of restricted by the No Child Left Behind policies really find creative ways to use creative assignments in science and mathematics, creative writing assignments that meet the standards, but also are relevant to that child's learning environment and also their ethnic and cultural identity. So I think that requires a particular kind of educational training for educators that doesn't always happen in graduate schools of education. But I think that by having various kinds of trainings and support for teachers, that they can figure out how to do that.